So, as I told you at the beginning of this lecture, civil liberties and civil rights are two distinct things. Now, I've been talking primarily in terms of civil liberties, being able to do things without government interference, or without fear that the government is going to try to penalize you. But civil rights are something different. Civil rights are not about trying to avoid the government interfering with you, but in fact, civil rights are about seeking out guarantees from the government that you will be able to participate in politics and society without fear of discrimination based on status, such as race, gender, religious affiliation, or national origin. So, the idea of civil rights, or the intuition behind the concept of civil rights, is not new. It comes from this Aristotelian idea of justice that you have to treat like cases alike. You have to treat similar situations in a similar way, regardless of who is involved. So, equal protection under the law is enshrined in the current form of the Constitution in the 14th Amendment. You cannot deny equal protection under the law to any individual. So, the core idea is prohibition of discrimination. But again, like with civil liberties, the United States has a long history of not necessarily living the Constitution to the letter. We've constantly been presented with questions of how and when we can treat people differently, a lot of times with very good reason. So, for example, 18-year-olds can't buy alcohol or cigarettes. That is a public health measure that is meant to ensure the health and safety of individual citizens. However, it does discriminate based on age. Universities and colleges don't all have open admissions policies. So a university can discriminate against students from accessing its educational resources by virtue of their previous education, their qualifications, their age perhaps, or the quality of their application. Politically, this has meant, um, in terms of civil rights, the the question of whether or not all people should be able to participate in an equal fashion. Even then, 18-year-olds are only able to vote once they turn 18. When they're 17 and younger, they have no such rights. Should all votes count the same? Right now, we operate under the principle of one person, one vote. However, there have been constant questions as to whether or not people's vote should count the same. So, I am a political science professor, a government professor. In theory, anyway, I'm supposed to know more about government and politics than the typical person, the average Joe. Should my vote count more than other people's because of uh, the amount of time I spend studying politics and governance? I mean, I might like to think so, but when it comes right down to it, my vote should not matter any more than yours. But this hasn't stopped other people from using the same rationale. Should intelligence matter? Should civic knowledge matter? Should one's level of education matter? Wealth has played a role historically in whether or not one's vote counts. For a good part of our history, only property owners were allowed to vote. And to this day, how much your vote counts in the Electoral College for the presidency depends on which state you live in. If you live in Wyoming, by virtue of how electoral votes are allocated, your vote counts about 3 times more than the typical Californian or Texan. So, civil rights are guarantees to participate in politics and society. And as I said before, in voting rights, for example, There is no federal right to vote, but it does say that you cannot be discriminated against based on certain criteria. Federal law, I should say, states that you cannot be discriminated against if you fall under what are called protected classes. So you can't be discriminated against based on your race, creed, or color, your religion, national origin, your age if you're over 40, your gender or sex, your disability, your genetic information, pregnancy status, familial status, or veteran status. So federal law states that you cannot be discriminated against in employment or other public sectors of life based on these classes. That being said, we have a lot of history of having something in theory, but not practicing it the way we say we are. Civil liberties and civil rights are no different. So throughout our history, we know about the tragic legacy of slavery in this country. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and that was followed by the 14th and 15th Amendments that guaranteed equal process under the law and equal participation for African Americans in politics and public life. However, these rights were very weakly defended, and in the South, they were almost non-existent throughout the Jim Crow era. Voting rights, for example, were repeatedly violated, despite the fact that the 15th Amendment guaranteed that African American men should not be discriminated against when it came to participation in politics. The implementation of poll taxes were instituted in southern states in an effort to prevent African Americans from voting. Literacy tests were often implemented. However, there was one caveat. These tests were not, on the face of it, aimed at keeping African Americans from voting. However, keep in mind that this was during the Jim Crow era, and the way you could be exempt from these rules is if your grandfather was able to vote. If your grandfather was legally able to vote in the United States, then Southerners were exempt from poll taxes or literacy tests. And to this day, if you are exempt from a rule because it is newly established, it is still called being grandfathered in. So this is one example of a literacy test taken from Louisiana in the 1940s. I want you to take a look at it very briefly, pause this video, read the questions, and I want you to really think about whether or not you could pass this exam. Many of the questions are confusing. Many of the questions seemingly don't have straightforward or exact answers. I don't consider myself to be the smartest person, but I am fairly well versed in government and politics. I couldn't make heads or tails of some of these questions. And whether or not an individual passed this test was pretty much up to the discretion of the election administrator. And of course, there was the issue of segregation in education and housing. Now, there was some progress made through executive orders. Truman, for example, ordered that the military be desegregated. Several court rulings, such as Brown v. Board of Education, which prohibited discrimination in schools, Katzenbach v. McClung, which upheld laws that prohibited discrimination in restaurants. Then, of course, there's the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination in public spaces, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which abolished poll taxes and literacy tests and guaranteed that the right to vote should not be withheld on the basis of race. Other demographics that have faced civil rights issues are women. Despite the fact that women are the majority of the citizens in this country, women have faced ongoing discrimination, not only historically, but in contemporary times. So there was an attempt to fix this through the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s, which would guarantee that constitutionally there should be no discrimination on the basis of sex. That ultimately failed. However, there are periodic attempts to reinvigorate that movement. Title IX was meant to, and Title IX of the Civil Rights Act guaranteed gender equality in educational settings. However, there is ongoing discrimination in this country when it comes to pay. I'm sure many of you have heard the statistic that to this day, women make 77 cents for every dollar that a man makes. And then there's also the issue of harassment and how women disproportionately face workplace and educational harassment when compared to men. Representation is another issue in which women have faced barriers. Though they make up a majority of the citizens in the country, only 20% of the senators, as of right now, are women. And going back to the times we live in, 60% of essential workers right now are women. And so women can be argued to be disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic.